Lean back, close your eyes, step into the dark. Now, I'll take you into one of the strangest royal secrets of the past. The year is 1567. We're inside the royal palace of Denmark. Opulent carpets beneath our feet, gilded mirrors lining the walls, silver candelabras casting flickering shadows. But something inside is not quite right, because a king stands before a mirror, and something is missing from his face. This is the bizarre tale of King Frederik II. Was it just a nose that fell on the battlefield one day? Or was it the fall of imperial pride, of fashion, of identity itself? This is the story of how a lost nose became not only a medical concern, but a cultural crisis, and how it quietly lit the fuse for one of Europe's most peculiar fashion trends, the era of the fake nose, a king who lost his own, only to be fitted with one made of metal. And then something spread through the palace. Hundreds of noses, crafted from gold, from copper, from ivory, each nose a mask, each mask a secret. King Frederik was no longer just a ruler. He had become a fashion icon, a symbol of obsession, the missing piece of a royal face. If you're ready, let us begin the tale of history's most unusual royal accessory. This is not just a nose. This is the face of a kingdom. It was the kind of morning that carried tension in the air, cold, silent, and heavy with fog. The dense woods outside Schleswig were quiet, save for the crunching of hooves and the occasional caw of a crow. King Frederik II, wrapped in a thick fur cloak, guided his horse with practiced ease. His hunting party followed closely behind, nobles in colorful coats, jesters trailing with dogs, and a few guards barely suppressing yawns. But the hunt was not what it seemed. The king had not come to chase deer or wild boar. He had come to confront. Riding at his side was Count Joachim Blom, a nobleman from the southern provinces, with a reputation for arrogance, and worse, a tongue too sharp for his own good. Whispers had reached the king that Joachim had spoken, ill of the royal court mocking Frederik's leadership, laughing at his drunken temper, even questioning the legitimacy of his crown. "You speak boldly in halls where I am absent," Frederik said, his voice calm but laced with threat. "Do you have the same courage under the sky?" Joachim smiled thinly, as if this were all a game. "Your Majesty, I speak only truth, and truth, like a hound, needs no leash." That was enough. Frederik halted his horse and stepped down, tossing his fur aside. Snow clung to his boots. A silent signal passed between them. They would duel. Swords were drawn. The noblemen formed a circle among the frostbitten trees. Even the dogs fell silent. At first, it was a clash of metal and pride. The king fought not with elegance, but with force-slashing wildly, as if to punish not just Joachim, but every whisper of betrayal in his court. Then came the mistake. Joachim ducked beneath a high swing and countered with a quick upward slice. The blade missed the king's throat, but caught something else. Frederik screamed. Blood painted the snow. He dropped his sword, fell to his knees, clutching his face. His gloved hands came away wet and red. There was a sudden stillness in the forest, broken only by the ragged breaths of the king. When the guards reached him, they saw the wound. Half of his nose was gone. They rode back to the palace in silence. Joachim was taken into custody. The other nobles said nothing. The forest that day had not swallowed a deer but a piece of a king back in Helsinger. Royal physicians tried everything: wine-soaked gauze, honey poultices, even crushed pearl powder. But it was too late. The flesh was mangled beyond repair. Behind closed doors, Frederik would scream into the night, not from pain, but rage. His reflection now stared back at him as something less than royal, less than whole. It was in that broken silence that a new obsession began. The palace halls were quiet, not out of respect, but uncertainty. The king had returned, but not as he left. Whispers rippled through corridors, like wind under a door brief, hushed and frightened. No one dared to speak too loudly, and no one dared to laugh. It was as if the walls themselves were listening. King Frederik II had locked himself inside his private chamber for 3 days. Curtains remained drawn, meals left untouched at the door. The once boisterous king, known for his feasts, his wild hunts, his roaring laughter, had vanished inside. A different Frederik paced endlessly. The wound had been cleaned, but it had not healed. Stitched and sealed, the gash where his nose had once stood now resembled a cruel joke, a cavity of shame, a hole in the middle of power. And yet, it wasn't the pain that haunted him, it was the mirror. Each morning he sat before it, long, silent, staring. His crown rested on the nearby table, as if mocking him. What kind of king ruled with half a face? He tried to distract himself with letters from foreign courts, petitions from the nobility, even old maps of war campaigns. But his eyes always drifted back to the mirror. The silence became a second skin. Even his servants tiptoed through the halls, avoiding eye contact. Only his loyal hound remained near, curled at the foot of the bed, sensing something was wrong, yet unable to understand. By the 5th day, a court painter was summoned in secret. He arrived nervously, brushes clinking in his leather pouch. Frederik ordered him to paint his new likeness, not the young warrior king, but the truth, the wound, the hollowness, the broken man behind the crown. When the artist hesitated, Frederik slammed his fist on the table. "Paint what you see," he bellowed. The finished canvas was hidden away, never displayed, but those who glimpsed it said the king's eyes looked like stone, cold, trapped. Later that week, a small group of scholars and physicians were called into a private council. The king entered, hooded, the wound still bandaged beneath thin cloth. Without ceremony, he declared, "This face is no longer mine. Make me another." They thought he was mad, but none dared say it. Instead, they bowed, and the first sketches began. A nose made of copper, perhaps. Silver, better. Something that could restore the symmetry of power and illusion of wholeness. Night. Frederik sat by the fire, no longer reading, no longer pacing, just sitting, listening to the wind, watching the flames cast flickering shadows on his wounded profile. A mask was coming, but no mask could hide the silence inside. The scent of molten metal began to creep into the palace long before anyone saw the smoke. Somewhere deep within the royal workshops, hammer strikes echoed through the stone corridors. A transformation had begun, not of the kingdom, but of its king. The order was clear: forge a nose. But this was no ordinary request. It could not be carved from wood, nor sculpted from wax. It had to be strong, dignified, and permanent. A prosthetic worthy of a monarch. And more importantly, it had to hide the truth. The man chosen for this task was Hans von Mechena, metalsmith, from Lübeck. With fingers as precise as a surgeon's, he had once crafted filigreed hilts for noble swords, ceremonial goblets for foreign kings, and now he was summoned to create the impossible, a royal nose. He arrived at the palace discreetly, escorted through servant tunnels to avoid the curious eyes of the court. The king greeted him not with words, but with a nod and a parchment drawing of his own face, marked with measurements, angles, and annotations in his own hand. "This," the king said finally, "will be better than the one I lost." Hans studied the notes carefully. Silver was too soft, bronze too dull, but a mixture, perhaps silver-lined with gold leaf, could provide both shine and strength. He sketched ideas, each design more elaborate than the last. Some noses had floral engravings, others had delicate hinges to allow breath to pass. One even resembled a knight's visor, sleek and terrifying. Meanwhile, the court whispered, word had spread not of the injury, but of the king's project. Servants traded rumors in kitchens. Courtiers speculated during chess matches. Was it vanity, madness, or something more profound? Some mocked him in private. Others were intrigued. Masked, they said, like a Roman general, like a god. But Frederik was not seeking to impress. He was reclaiming something that had been stolen: dignity, symmetry, command. In his mind, the nose was not just a solution, it was a statement. Within a week, the first prototype was ready, polished silver, lightly curved, with fine clasps to grip the cheekbones. It was tested on a wooden bust, then brought to the king. Frederik studied it in silence. Then he turned to a mirror and slowly raised it to his face. It did not fit perfectly. It pressed against old bruises. The clasp tugged at a healing scar. But as he looked into his reflection, he saw something unexpected. A face, a whole one. He didn't smile, but he also didn't look away. That night, he walked through the palace halls for the first time in weeks. Guards straightened, maids curtsied. No one spoke. They all looked at him and they all saw the nose. The king had returned, but he was not the same man. He was remade. At first, no one dared speak of it. When King Frederik returned to court wearing a glinting silver nose, the courtiers bowed a little deeper. The chamber musicians played a little softer, and the palace guards held their eyes forward with unnatural focus. The atmosphere shifted like a held breath. But silence doesn't last long in a palace. By the second week, murmurs began to echo through marble corridors. At first, they were cautious. It's admirable. Some said that the king faces the world at all. Others whispered behind folding fans, calling it grotesque, theatrical, even unholy. But one thing was certain. They were watching, and watching turned into wondering. What would it be like to wear one? The court painter, forbidden from displaying the king's post-injury portrait, began sketching copies of the prosthetic nose from memory. He sold them in secret to curious nobles who commissioned their own versions, not out of need, but desire. A new shape, a new identity. He claimed it was a tribute to the king's bravery. Others called it mockery. The next week, Baroness Ingrid arrived with a rose gold tip affixed to her own, fully intact nose. It matched her gown. By spring, there were over a dozen nobles walking the palace halls with artificial noses, some affixed with ribbon, others with delicate chains, one with tiny pearls sewn along the ridge. It was no longer about imitation. it was style. King Frederik said nothing. He watched them parade through the banquet hall as if auditioning for a new order. In a way, they were. What began as concealment had become celebration. The flaw was, now, fashionable ambassadors from France and Spain reported back in confused tones. The Danish king wears a metal nose. So do his courtiers. It is unsettling, but they couldn't ignore it. Tailors began adjusting hat brims to better show off prosthetics. Goldsmiths competed to make the lightest, most ornate models. The palace blacksmith had to learn engraving in private. Some wondered if the king's madness had spread like perfume through velvet halls, but others saw something else control by making his weakness public and then making it desirable. Frederik had turned shame into sovereignty. He was no longer just the man who lost his nose. He was the king who turned a wound into a symbol, a fashion, a weapon in the months to come. Portraits would be painted with artificial noses, proudly displayed, some even exaggerated in size and shine. One noble posed with 3 different models. In hand, like a collection of masks, the age of the false nose had begun, and the court would never look the same again. The letters began arriving like clockwork, from Versailles to Prague, from Edinburgh to Florence. Foreign envoys wrote home with reports that grew stranger by the week. What began as diplomatic notes soon read like theater reviews. The King of Denmark now wears a silver nose, so do his nobles. The court appears in masks of polished metal, as if carnival never ended. Some reports carried tones of amusement, others concern. One Spanish ambassador declared it theatrical blasphemy. A Venetian merchant described it as brilliantly absurd. The French, naturally, were intrigued. In the French court, Catherine de' Medici was said to have laughed when she first heard the rumor. But after reviewing sketches sent by her envoys, images of nobles with bronze and ivory prosthetics, draped in silk, her curiosity turned to admiration. "It's not madness," she reportedly said. "It's branding." European courts, long obsessed with image, began to view Denmark not as barbaric, but avant-garde, a nation bold enough to make flaw into fashion. Within months, whispers of the nose court spread through salons and noble gatherings. Foreign nobles visiting Denmark returned home with more than trade agreements. They brought back souvenirs. Copies of prosthetic designs were commissioned in Paris. Italian sculptors experimented with ceramic models. A Polish count was seen at a masquerade wearing a cobalt blue nose shaped like an eagle's beak. The Catholic Church, however, was less amused. A letter from the Archbishop of Cologne condemned the practice as vanity stitched onto deformity, warning that a ruler who conceals God's punishments behind gold is inviting divine wrath. The Vatican remained silent, but cardinals began referring to Frederik as Rex Mascaradus, the masked king. Frederik, for his part, remained unbothered. He had no intention of hiding. When a Spanish delegation arrived that spring, he met them in full ceremonial regalia, cloak of ermine, crown polished to perfection, and his nose gleaming like a blade. He spoke with confidence, laughed heartily, and raised his goblet high. The Spanish ambassador, stunned by the audacity, later wrote, "I did not meet a crippled monarch, but a creature of myth, a man who bleeds metal and dines on spectacle." At home, Danish poets began composing verses about the golden face. artists painted Frederik surrounded by celestial light, his prosthetic catching the sun like a holy relic by turning himself into legend. Frederik had done what few rulers dared. He controlled his own myth, but beneath the silver surface, something darker was forming, because legends are hard to live up to, and harder still to breathe. By midsummer, King Frederik II was no longer hiding behind his prosthetic nose. He was ruling through it. The silver glint of his artificial feature had become his insignia. When he spoke, it caught the torchlight. When he turned, it drew shadows across his cheek. When he sat on his throne, it pointed like an arrow down the long hall of power. This was no accident. Frederik had begun to incorporate the nose into every royal performance. Portraits commissioned by his court now included exaggerated renderings of the prosthetic, longer, sharper, glossier than reality. His official seal was altered slightly, the outline of a nose silhouette etched faintly into the royal crest. Even the embroidery on his robe cuffs mirrored the curve of his new feature. He was rebuilding himself, piece by deliberate piece. His advisors noticed the shift. So did the court, where once he brooded in isolation. Frederik now appeared at every gathering, striding through banquets like a war general. He had new uniforms, made some dark and brooding, others radiant and trimmed in gold thread. His prosthetic changed with them, a blackened iron model for days of mourning, a mirror-polished brass version for festival nights. The message was clear. The mask was not just a replacement tit, was a weapon in the throne room. The king now held audiences in silence for the first minute. He would sit in stillness, letting the presence of the mask speak before he did. Some envoys found it unnerving. Others described it as divine. To some, he had become more than a man. Children in the streets drew pictures of the silver-faced king. Nobles sent requests to have their own small imperfections masked in the same style. In Lübeck, artisans opened entire shops dedicated to facial accessories. The term Frederican fashion was coined by German satirists and then adopted seriously by Danish high society. And all the while, Frederik watched, not with arrogance, but calculation. He had lost flesh, but he had gained narrative. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had once been mocked behind closed doors. Now, foreign courts were mimicking him. The court of Sweden, in a rare act of diplomacy, sent him a sculpted ivory nose inlaid with sapphires. It was, officially, a gift of admiration. Unofficially, it was an act of surrender. For Frederik, this was more than triumph. It was transformation. Yet, in the quiet of his chamber, he would sometimes remove the nose and place it on velvet. Beside his bed, the skin beneath was still raw. The wound had never fully healed. He would stare into the mirror just for a moment and remember, beneath every icon, there is still a man. What began as imitation quickly spiraled into obsession. By autumn, the Danish court had become an ever-shifting stage of prosthetic experimentation. Nobles no longer wore fake noses out of sympathy for the king or in silent protest against aging. They wore them because it was expected. They wore them because not wearing one made you invisible. At court banquets, it was no longer enough to wear silk or jewels. What mattered was the nose, a curled bronze snout with emerald tips, a porcelain crescent inlaid with rubies. One nobleman, Eric of Funan, writhed with a delicate lace veil, draped over a copper nose engraved with Latin verses. He bowed and declared it a mask for modesty. Frederik watched it all unfold with a kind of distant amusement. His own prosthetics remained regal, even restrained, compared to the more flamboyant designs worn by his courtiers. But he knew what he had done. He had cracked the mirror of vanity and let the pieces fall where they may. By October, nose competitions had begun, none official, of course, but fiercely judged. Prizes were whispered to be favors from the crown, secret appointments, or simply courtly fame. Artists were flooded with commissions. Goldsmiths started branding their designs. The finest noses bore marks no bigger than a fingernail, denoting origin and value. At the mid-harvest feast, the palace resembled something between a masquerade and an armory. Rows of nobles entered the great hall, each nose more elaborate than the last. Some glowed with enamel paints, others ticked quietly like clockwork curiosities. A few had scent diffusers, built inside dripping with perfume and rosewater. One courtier fainted after a rival's nose emitted a puff of scented steam directly into her face. Foreign guests visiting during this fever dreamed of it for weeks. They all wore false noses, wrote a Dutch envoy, and not one was alike. It was as if I had dined with phantoms. But beneath the sparkle and shine, a new problem began to stir. Some nobles began altering their real noses, them with pressure bands, applying dangerous poultices to distort their shape, even allowing them to be broken, so that they could better justify the use of prosthetics. Pain, it seemed, had become fashionable. Whispers of disfigurement for design reached the king's ears. One morning, Frederik summoned his inner circle and stood in silence, gazing across a room of masked faces. "You wear them like jewelry," he said softly, "but remember what it cost me." That evening, he commissioned a new nose for himself, plainer, darker, made of iron and leather. It bore no jewels, only scars, and it said more than any gold ever could. There came a day when King Frederik II could no longer recognize his court. The hall had been transformed into a gallery of light and illusion. Chandeliers blazed, tapestries shimmered, and the nobles entered one by one, each adorned in fabrics imported from the far corners of Europe. But it was not the silks or pearls that stole attention. It was the noses, 40-7 variations, a brass swan beak, a filigreed latticework resembling a rose. One marquise wore a nose shaped like a seashell, with a tiny hidden locket that opened to reveal a portrait of her lover. Another strutted with a glass-tipped prosthetic filled with colored oil that rippled as he walked. The king sat at the head of the table, silent. He no longer marveled, no longer smiled. He simply observed a sovereign among jesters who didn't know they had become parody. Whispers reached him from across the table. Two young nobles were heard debating the merits of nose height as a sign of moral character. Another was drafting a poem dedicated not to a lady's eyes, but to the silver flare of her prosthesis. Even the royal minstrel had composed a ballad titled "The Nose Knows," which he dared perform at supper. Frederik stood up mid-song and left the hall. The applause faltered. He retreated to his private wing, robes trailing behind him like the remnants of dignity. Alone in the chamber, he unfastened his iron leather nose and set it beside a growing collection of older models, silver, gold, brass, even ivory. a kingdom of faces. He looked into the mirror and saw nothing but a blur. Where was the king? Now was he in the metal, in the myth? Or had he vanished the moment flesh gave way to symbol? That night he summoned his physician, not to treat a wound, but to speak. They wear the thing, he said, but they do not carry the weight. The physician remained silent. Frederik gestured to the prosthetics. Each of these costs something: pain, humiliation, fear, but for them it's just jewelry. He paused, then asked a question no one had ever expected. If I remove it forever, will they still follow me? The physician did not answer. Outside, the court still danced. Inside, the king sat in the dark, facing a reflection that no longer obeyed him. The court was divided. Some saw the king's metal nose as a crown of strength, a symbol of resilience and rebirth. Others whispered that it was a prison, a mask hiding vulnerability and pain. Frederik himself was caught in this crossfire. One evening, in the privacy of his chambers, he removed his prosthetic and looked at his reflection, the raw, scarred flesh beneath a symbol so carefully crafted. I am both, he whispered, the man who bleeds and the mask that blinds. The next day, a small faction of courtiers approached him with a bold request. Your Majesty, they said cautiously, perhaps it is time to show your true face to the realm, to remind them of the man behind the mask. Frederik was silent. For a long moment, I have worn this mask for years, he finally replied. It has saved me and condemned me, but the truth is, I do not know if I am ready. The courtiers nodded, sensing his struggle. In the weeks that followed, rumors spread. Some nobles began to remove their own prosthetics in quiet rebellion. The fashion, once irresistible, now felt like a chain dot at court. Tension simmered. During one public audience, a young noble dared to speak out. Your Majesty, he said, we admire your courage and your mask, but perhaps it is time to let the man within shine again. The hall fell silent. Frederik met the young man's gaze. Then slowly, deliberately, he reached up and unclasped his metal nose. Gasps filled the chamber. His scarred face was revealed, uneven, marked by battle and time. But his eyes shone with fierce determination. I am no longer hiding, he declared. Some applauded. Others murmured with discomfort. But Frederik had made his choice. The mask was no longer the king. He was. The days following the king's revelation were unlike any Copenhagen had seen. Whispers rippled through the city streets. Some citizens hailed the king's courage. Others squinted in disbelief. The metal nose was gone, but the man beneath remains, weathered but undeniably human. Frederik's courtiers adjusted. Some remained loyal, others grew distant. The palace, once a stage for gleaming masks, now felt raw and exposed at the market. Tavern keepers told stories of the unmasked monarch, no longer a mysterious figure behind silver, but a king who faced his people boldly. The king himself was not immune to change. He began holding open audiences where he listened rather than commanded. He walked among the people, greeting them without pretense. The scar on his face was no longer hidden, but a badge of survival. Foreign dignitaries arrived with curiosity and caution. Some complimented his bravery. Artists were instructed to capture his unadorned face. The paintings showed a man both strong and vulnerably, ruler aware of his mortality. In time, the prosthetic nose became a relic, displayed in the royal chambers as a reminder of a past era. The court's obsession with artificial beauty faded. Nobles began to favor simpler attire and unmasked faces. The nose fashion became a curious footnote in history. But Frederik's legacy endured, not as the king who wore a mask, but as the king who dared to take it off. King Frederik's injury did more than alter his face, it changed the world around him. News of the metal noses spread beyond the palace walls, inspiring craftsmen and physicians across Denmark and Europe. A new field emerged at the crossroads of art and medicine: facial prosthetics. Surgeons began studying the king's wound and the prosthetics made for him. They sought ways to improve comfort, fit, and function. Experiments with materials like leather, wax, and even early plastics were conducted. The crown funded workshops that trained artisans and healers alike. Among the common folk, prosthetic noses became symbols of hope. People who had suffered injuries or diseases causing facial disfigurement sought similar devices. Tales of the king's courage inspired them to face their own challenges. At markets and fairs, artisans sold small replicas of the royal noses as charms against misfortune. Meanwhile, the noble fashion of artificial noses slowly trickled into towns and villages, where practicality replaced extravagance. Farmers, merchants, and soldiers wore simple models for protection or concealment. Letters from distant lands spoke of similar trends. In Italy, a craftsman crafted delicate ceramic noses for actors in Commedia dell'arte. In England, masks with noses became popular in theatrical performances. The king's influence had transcended royalty, but challenges remained. Many still feared stigma or ridicule. Prosthetics were often uncomfortable or fragile. Medical knowledge was limited, and infection was a constant threat. Yet progress marched forward. By the end of Frederik's reign, a community of skilled artisans, surgeons, and patrons had established a legacy, one that bridged the divide between disfigurement and dignity. The lost nose was no longer a curse, it was a catalyst. A new chapter in history had begun. What began as a royal necessity soon became a widespread trend. News of King Frederik's metallic noses traveled across borders, sparking fascination among nobles and commoners alike. The artistry and symbolism behind these prosthetics captured imaginations far beyond Denmark's courts. In villages, simple leather and wooden noses replaced elaborate metals for everyday wear, used to hide scars from injury, disease, or birthmarks. Farmers wore them to shield against harsh winds, merchants as signs of status, and soldiers to intimidate foes. Workshops in towns across Europe sprang up, blending local styles with the Danish designs. In Paris, nosemakers incorporated delicate lace and enamel. In Venice, artisans crafted noses shaped like mythical creatures, painted in vibrant colors. Markets buzzed with chatter about the nose fashion, and traveling merchants carried replicas as exotic curiosities. In some places, wearing a prosthetic nose became a sign of resilience, a badge worn with pride. Yet not all welcomed the trend. Traditionalists called it vanity. Clergy warned against playing God. Some rulers banned their courts from adopting such styles, fearing ridicule or loss of dignity. But the allure was hard to resist. Playwrights penned comedies mocking the noses, while poets wrote odes celebrating them. painters captured faces, both adorned and bare, preserving the evolving image of beauty and identity. Back in Denmark, King Frederik watched this cultural ripple with a mixture of pride and melancholy. His lost nose had given birth to a legacy neither he nor anyone could have foreseen. The merging of medicine and craftsmanship grew stronger with each passing year. As demand for prosthetic noses increased, surgeons and artisans collaborated more closely to improve comfort and functionality. They experimented with flexible materials, better adhesives, and designs that accommodated facial expressions. Medical treatises began to mention facial prosthetics as tools not only of concealment but of rehabilitation. Physicians documented techniques for fitting noses to damaged skin, addressing infection risks, and even restoring some sensory functions. Workshops evolved into centers of innovation. Master artisans crafted noses that were lighter, more durable, and artistically refined. Some incorporated hidden compartments for scent or small keepsakes. Others experimented with paint that matched skin tones. Patients ranged from wounded soldiers and accident victims to commoners who sought to hide congenital deformities or scars. Social attitudes slowly shifted. What was once seen as shameful or bizarre became accepted, even admired. Portraits from this era began to depict subjects with subtle prosthetics, blending seamlessly into their features. The line between mask and flesh blurred, yet challenges persisted. Many still feared social stigma, and accessibility remained limited to wealthier classes. But the legacy of King Frederik's lost nose had sparked a new path, one where healing and artistry intertwined. Generations passed, but the story of King Frederik II's lost nose remained alive in whispers and paintings. In Danish folktales, the metal-nosed king became a symbol of resilience and reinvention, a monarch who turned tragedy into triumph. Storytellers wove his tale into epic poems and children's rhymes, passing the legend from parent to child. Historians debated the truth behind the myth, some dismissing it as court gossip, others uncovering letters and portraits confirming the king's unusual fashion. Artists and playwrights revived the story during the Renaissance, casting Frederik as a tragic hero caught between flesh and facade. Museums displayed the surviving prosthetics, gleaming relics of an age where appearance was power and identity was forged in metal and myth. In modern times, the tale inspired fashion designers and performance artists alike. Avant-garde collections featured metallic accessories reminiscent of Frederik's iconic nose, symbolizing the blend of vulnerability and strength. Documentaries explored the king's influence on prosthetics, medicine, and cultural identity. Scholars connected his story to broader themes of how societies cope with injury and difference. The king's legacy lived not only in history books, but in the ongoing dialogue about human resilience, the body, and the masks we all wear. King Frederik II's story was more than a royal anecdote. It was a mirror reflecting the complexities of identity, resilience, and transformation. He had lost a part of his face, but gained a legacy that reshaped perceptions of beauty, power, and self. His prosthetic nose was not just metal, it was a symbol, a testament to human ingenuity and the will to turn injury into art. The court's obsession with masks had faded, replaced by a deeper understanding of what lies beneath. Frederik's journey showed that true strength is not in hiding scars, but in embracing them. In the end, the king's face, scarred, unmasked, and real, became a beacon for those who dare to face their truths. His lost nose had changed a kingdom, a culture, and perhaps even the course of history. And in that transformation, we find the face of change itself. The years passed, and the metal noses of King Frederik II became artifacts of a bygone-era testament to the enduring spirit of a man who turned loss into legend. In the quiet halls of Danish palaces, stories of the masked king whispered through the corridors, inspiring generations to face their own scars with courage. His tale etched not only in history but in the hearts of those who dare to transform pain into power, reminds us all that identity is more than skin deep. The face we show the world may be shaped by circumstance, but the spirit beneath is unbreakable. And so, the king who lost his nose gave us more than a fashion or a story. He gave us the courage to wear our truths proudly.